May 1666. A biting slate-gray rain is slashing across the northeast coast, whipping a desolate strip of salt marsh into a boiling soup of black mud. On the brackish banks of the Passaic River, a group of shivering, wild-eyed settlers stands huddled in a ditch, their hands white-knuckled around heavy European muskets. Ahead of them, emerging from the dense, mosquito-choked briars, are the tall, imposing figures of Hackensack warriors, their hands raised in a stark, unmistakable warning. Do not step onto this shore. This is not the sanitized, buckled shoe version of American history you learned in grade school. This is the real, raw reality. 34 years before the Salem witch trials, more than a century before the Declaration of Independence, the men scrambling ashore into this swampy wilderness were not searching for a land of liberty. They were fanatical, hardline religious extremists fleeing Connecticut because its society was becoming far too tolerant. Led by Captain Robert Treat, they wanted to build a completely locked, hyper-isolated sanctuary that was an uncompromising, holy outpost designed to completely shut out the corrupting influence of the outside world forever. Yet, the survival of this desperate, shivering settlement is a deep riddle that challenges the very foundation of our national story. Look beneath the modern asphalt of this chaotic metropolis. This is Newark, New Jersey. Today, it is a roaring, hyper-connected logistics titan, a global gateway built on concrete, global trade, and dark fiber tech. How does an insular, fanatical colony founded on total religious isolation transform into the smoking, clanking industrial beast that built an empire? How did this swampy religious sanctuary become the brutal, tank-occupied battlefield that broke the back of a corrupt political machine? The history of America does not start with pristine pilgrims. It starts right here in the forgotten mud, the bleeding steel, and the hidden secrets of this impossible city that refused to die. And what lies buried directly beneath these historic streets will reveal a narrative far darker and more miraculous than anything you have ever been told before. To understand why this settlement didn't wither into a ghost story, you have to look past the modern concrete and peer into the fanatical minds of its architects. When Pastor Abraham Pearson and his flock dipped their quills into black ink to sign the fundamental agreements, they weren't drafting a blueprint for a democratic American city. They were sealing a blood oath. This wasn't a beacon of liberty. It was a hyper-controlled, locked-down religious fortress. The law of this settlement was absolute and terrifyingly simple. If you were not an absolute baptized member of their strict congregational church, you were a ghost in the eyes of the law. You could not cast a single political ballot. You could not hold a public civil office. You couldn't even inherit or own a single square inch of the muddy marsh beneath your feet. They christened this radical colony Newark, a deliberate double meaning. On the surface, it honored an Old English hometown, but to the zealots whispering prayers in the dark, it was the new Ark of the Covenant, a holy vault designed to preserve their extreme religious purity by viciously shutting out a corrupting world forever. They even mandated that anyone who dared to subvert their faith would be forcefully driven into the wilderness. Imagine the sensory claustrophobia of this outpost. The rhythmic, droning echo of relentless Puritan prayers cutting through an empty, freezing wilderness, underscored by the sharp scratch of quills executing an uncompromising contract of human exclusion. For 15 years, this tight corporate iron grip held firm against the wilderness. But the Puritans had unconsciously walked into a structural paradox. They made a fatal, long-term calculation error. In their desperate search for total isolation, they built their hyper-exclusive holy sanctuary on top of the single most valuable, perfect geographic intermodal gateway on the North American continent. By choosing a flawless natural harbor and river junction to fortify their isolation, they had inadvertently set a brilliant secular trap, a geographic mechanism that would eventually attract an unstoppable avalanche of global commerce and completely dissolve their theocracy. To truly understand how this impossible outpost survived when so many other colonial experiments dissolved into ghost stories, you have to stop looking at the religious maps and start looking at the weapons. When Captain Robert Treat and his exhausted followers first drifted onto these shores, they were met with an immediate, high-stakes crisis of ownership. Governor Carteret had promised them this land, but the local Hackensack Indians flatly disputed the Crown's right to give it away. The settlers were trapped between a hostile wilderness and an unyielding indigenous force. But here is the pattern interrupt that the traditional history textbooks completely omit. The Puritans didn't launch a holy war, and they didn't rely on divine intervention. Instead, they engaged in a calculated, cold-blooded corporate transaction. In July 1667, standing in the heavy humidity of the Jersey marshes, Robert Treat sat down with the Hackensack sachems Wappamuk Harish and Captaman to broker a deal through an interpreter named Samuel Edsall. The Puritans possessed an absolute fortune of $64,000 in cash hoarded from their time in New England, but they did not spend a single silver coin to purchase the vast Essex tract. Instead, follow the assets. The transaction was fueled entirely by high-grade European technology, consumer goods, and psychological levers. The final deed was signed not with gold, but with a terrifying warehouse of armaments and diplomatic lubricants. The inventory traded for nearly all of modern-day Essex County was staggering: 50 double hands of gunpowder, 100 bars of lead, 20 axes, 20 coats, 10 guns, 20 pistols, and 20 anchors of heavy spirits. Imagine the scene: the metallic, heavy thud of lead bars hitting the river mud, and the sharp chemical tang of gunpowder barrels being rolled out alongside raw liquor. This wasn't a peaceful humanitarian treaty or a pristine wilderness settlement. It was a cold, high-stakes exchange of a lethal military arsenal for a continental empire. By arming the Hackensack, the Puritans fundamentally rewired the balance of indigenous power in the region, ensuring their own survival through this strategic deal. Fast forward to November 1776. The original Puritan theocracy has entirely dissolved, replaced by a critical strategic crossroads on the absolute brink of human extinction. General George Washington and his Continental Army, a broken and shivering force of 3,500 exhausted, mud-soaked men, are fleeing in total disgrace after experiencing catastrophic losses across New York. They collapse into the small village of Newark for 6 frantic days, desperately seeking a brief moment to breathe while Lord Cornwallis and his brutal British vanguard charge hot on their heels. The terrifying sounds of pursuing enemy bugles echo clearly over the freezing Essex hills. This is definitely not the glorious, sanitized textbook story of a triumphant revolution. It is a desperate, frantic scramble through the freezing winter sludge. But here is the critical tactical turning point that the mainstream history narratives usually skip over entirely. Washington did not win the war here through standard military genius. He survived it by actively weaponizing the brutal geography of the Passaic River. Realizing his supply lines were completely exposed and his men were nearly finished, Washington issued a high-stakes, utterly ruthless command. He ordered his troops to hold the vital wooden bottleneck known as the Aquakanonk Bridge just long enough for his broken columns to tramp safely across, and then instantly burn and dismantle it into the freezing waters below. This was not an organized, strategic retreat. It was a razor-thin, mud-splattered gamble against time itself. By completely destroying the primary river crossing, Washington trapped the world's most powerful navy and army on the opposite shore, forcing a sudden, critical halt to the British advance. look closely at the muddy soil where these historic colonial paths intersected. How does a single, frantic 6-day delay in a shivering New Jersey village keep the fragile spark of the entire American Revolution from being permanently snuffed out? The answer lies inside the strategic depth of a landscape that refused to bow under imperial pressure. Washington eventually marched away toward final historical victory, leaving behind a broken wooden network that actively defied imperial defeat. To understand how this strict Puritan sanctuary completely inverted its own genetic code, you have to look into the blinding fire of an industrial furnace. In 1813, an uncommercial, eccentric mechanical genius named Seth Boyden stepped off a stagecoach into Newark. He did not care about personal wealth, and he did not care about holy salvation. He cared about the raw physics of materials. Boyden looked at a city built on the early trade of tanning leather and decided to fundamentally change how the young American Republic manufactured its future. In 1819, he unlocked the secret European process for producing patent leather, creating an ultra-glossy, water-resistant material that instantly shattered America's economic dependence on luxury British imports. But his true alchemical miracle occurred 7 years later, in 1826. For centuries, engineers had been plagued by a massive structural limitation. Cast iron was incredibly strong, but fatally brittle. Hit it with a heavy hammer, and it would shatter like a tea cracker. Boyden spent months experimenting in his smoke-filled foundry, pushing chemistry to its absolute limit. He took ordinary, brittle iron castings, packed them into intense kilns, and subjected them to a relentless, white-hot inferno for 9 days and 9 nights without stopping. When the smoke finally cleared, a total miracle of metallurgy had occurred. The extreme heat had completely altered the metal molecular bonds. He had invented malleable cast iron, a legendary material that could absorb heavy ballistic blows and bend under immense mechanical pressure without ever breaking. This single material breakthrough instantly weaponized America's westward expansion, supplying the heavy hardware, harness loops, and locomotive parts that built a continental empire. This single city scaled up at an impossible velocity, manufacturing nearly 90% of all patent leather in the United States and flooding global markets with unbeatable ironware. How does a holy theocracy transform into the literal clanking workshop of the world? This city refused to be bound by its pious, isolated past. Instead, it chose fire. It survived by choosing to bend rather than shatter under the extreme, relentless pressure of an industrial revolution. To truly comprehend the sheer material scale of this architectural transformation, you must stop looking at the surface maps and start looking deep into the trenches. By the stormy dawn of the 20th century, the original Puritan dream of holy, isolated protection was completely buried beneath an unstoppable, roaring avalanche of global trade and dense immigrant labor, with foreign workers making up over 70% of the city's surging population. Newark was no longer a quaint colonial village. It had violently mutated into a massive, hyper-dense intermodal monster, a global logistics titan anchored by the immense engineering audacity of the Morris Canal in 1831, the deepwater industrial basins of Port Newark in 1916, and the nation's first commercial paved airport runway by 1928. By 1920, the human population had exploded to nearly 500,000 citizens, tightly compressing bodies and businesses into an urban landscape that was actively suffocating under the heavy weight of its own chaotic economic success. The city desperate, crowded streets were completely gridlocked, needing a radical infrastructure miracle to unlock the economic jam. They found that miracle by entombing their own industrial history. In a stroke of pure architectural audacity completed by 1935, urban planners took the stagnant, toxic, hand-dug trench of the old Morris Canal and entirely entombed it beneath thousands of tons of structural concrete and solid asphalt to pave Raymond Boulevard. But beneath that new driving surface, inside the dark, hollow ghost channel dug out by the bloody hands of desperate 19th-century Irish immigrants, they constructed the subterranean Newark City subway network. Close your eyes and listen closely to the modern metropolitan grid. The hollow, echoing screech of heavy steel light rail wheels scraping through a dark, subterranean trench is the literal sound of human trade running right through a forgotten, entombed riverbed of industrial progress. But this intense, hyperdense compression of global capital, massive transportation networks, and desperate immigrant bodies was secretly setting a highly dangerous, slow-burning demographic fuse that was mathematically guaranteed to explode with devastating systemic force across the entire post-war United States historic city landscape. To understand how this industrial titan was dragged into its darkest, most volatile era, you have to stop looking at the progress maps and start looking at the cold math of spatial displacement. Following World War II, the Great Migration brought a massive wave of Black Americans north, seeking a promised land, only to slam into a rigid wall of institutional redlining and rapid white flight. Enter urban renewal, a clinical system that author James Baldwin famously weaponized as Negro removal. Newark undertook more urban renewal spending per capita than any other major city in the nation. But this was not a plan for renewal. It was a cold, calculated erasure. Look closely at the devastating math recorded between 1949 and 1967. Armed with hundreds of millions in federal funds, planners unleashed an architectural scythe across the landscape. They demolished 10,000 historic buildings, flattening 2,500 acres of compacted family neighborhoods. In the process, they forcefully displaced 50,000 human beings. And here is the pattern interrupt the traditional history books skip. A staggering 77% of those displaced residents were Black, in a city where the Black population was only 34% in 1960. Imagine the sensory horror of the Central Ward. The deafening, constant roar of diesel bulldozers tearing through generations of community infrastructure, while a thick, vibrating cloud of pulverized red brick dust hangs over the pavement. City officials argued they were clearing blighted slums, but they were actually using massive interstate highway corridors like Interstates 78 and 280 to slice the city apart. They bulldozed homes to clear massive tracts for institutional campus expansions, including the University of Medicine and Dentistry. Thousands of citizens watched their entire worlds, their localized wealth, and their social safety nets completely liquidated by powerful institutions. They weren't building a stable future for the inhabitants. They were actively carving a slow-burning demographic fuse straight through the architecture of the city. This corporate layout formed a volatile urban trap that was mathematically guaranteed to detonate with absolute structural fury across the post-war landscape, permanently shattering any fragile illusion of the northern promised land. On the hot summer evening of July 12, 1967, the slow-burning demographic fuse finally hit the powder keg outside the Hayes Homes public housing complex. Residents looking down out of their tenement windows witnessed a horrific sight that completely shattered any remaining illusion of civic peace. A Black cab driver named John Smith, bloodied and completely incapacitated after a brutal roadside arrest, was being violently dragged across the hot asphalt directly into the closed doors of the 4th Precinct by white police officers. Within minutes, frantic alerts began crackling wildly across local cab radios, spreading the raw news of the beating like wildfire through the surrounding streets. The city completely exploded into 5 days of raw, unyielding armed rebellion against a systemically corrupt political machine that had excluded them for generations. The state response was immediate, terrifying, and completely unprecedented on American urban soil. Officials effectively launched a full-scale military counter-siege, deploying 3,464 heavily armed National Guardsmen alongside state troopers, rolling heavy battle tanks directly down ordinary neighborhood avenues. Imagine the sensory chaos of those 5 historic days, the sharp shatter of glass, the blinding, acrid burn of tear gas hanging thick in the summer air, and the deafening, terrifying rattle of machine guns tearing mercilessly through brick tenement walls. This was not a generic isolated urban riot. It was a total tectonic collapse of the old social contract. When the smoke finally cleared over the scarred pavement, 26 human beings lay dead, and 727 were wounded, leaving over 1,500 people arrested. But the old, heavily consolidated white political machine had been completely broken forever. This brutal, blood-stained battlefield paved a direct path to the historic mayoral election of 1970, when voters organized to elect Kenneth Gibson, a brilliant civil engineer who became the Northeast's very first black mayor. The walls of the 4th Precinct did not just witness a crisis they absorbed, a revolution that completely rewrote the absolute blueprint of urban political power in America, proving that freedom endures. Bring the story of this impossible outpost straight into the 21st century and you witness a jaw-dropping digital inversion that challenges everything you think you know about urban decay. Beneath the cracked pavement of blocks that still carry the deep structural scars of 1967 lies a hidden subterranean empire, 27 miles of ultra-high-speed dark fiber optic networks. This silent underground grid has turned a city once reduced to smoke into a data-driven magnet for global tech titans, pulling in multi-billion-dollar corporate anchors like Audible, Panasonic, and Prudential. Major national outlets have even hailed this surging landscape as the next Silicon Valley. But if you want to understand the true trajectory of America's future, you have to look past the pristine corporate glass and start looking at the real human layout. Rutgers' Newark researchers have issued a chilling warning about this modern boom, calling it a prime blueprint for jobless gentrification. Imagine the deep visual contradiction. The cool, silent hum of immense server racks glowing in the dark, and multi-billion-dollar technology hubs sitting pristine in downtown glass towers looming over crumbling pavements, while blocks away 1/3 of the surrounding neighborhood population remains trapped entirely below the federal poverty line. This digital renaissance is not a simple clean victory. It is a complex corporate overlay that hides a deeper social fragmentation. Can a hidden grid of glass fibers and high-speed algorithms ever truly heal the historical wounds left by decades of systemic redlining, architectural displacement, and military tanks in the Central Ward? This brings us straight back to the core riddle of our origin story. History is not a static line in a textbook. It is a vertical reality where raw capital constantly clashes with the unyielding grit of street-level survival. The modern tech towers didn't erase the past, they simply stacked another complex layer on top of a muddy foundation that has been absorbing intense systemic pressure for over 3 centuries. This deep systemic division reminds us that progress is often bought at a heavy cost. To truly understand the soul of the American experiment, you have to realize that history is not a flat line moving across a map from east to west. It is depth. It is a vertical reality where a 17th century Puritan zealot seeking total religious isolation, a 19th century industrial alchemist baking cast iron in a 9-day inferno, a mid-century resident watching their home get crushed by a bureaucratic bulldozer, and a modern software engineer tracking data packets are all standing on the exact same square inch of muddy Passaic soil, bound together by the very same heavy salt air. This city proves that our origin story is not a straight line of clean expansion, but a messy, violent, and miraculous collision of opposing forces. It is the story of a landscape that absorbed every blow the world could unleash and simply grew denser, stronger, and more unyielding. Decades ago, Mayor Kenneth Gibson issued a prophetic phrase that continues to define our modern world. Wherever America's cities are going, Newark will get there first. This impossible outpost was never just a place. It was a vertical warning system for the future of a continent. And that fire only stays lit as long as there are people willing to carry the torch of truth. If the story of this city, the settlement that entombed its own rivers to build an empire of iron and light, changes the way you look at the ground beneath your feet, then you belong here. Chronicles of Time is a community for the curious, the skeptics, and the survivors who realize that the official version of history is usually just the surface, and that the real power lies in the layers we have been told to forget. Click the subscribe button, smash that notification bell, and join our excavation of the human spirit. Tell us down in the comments, what hidden layer of your own city is waiting to be uncovered? Don't let the silence reclaim it. Join us, and let's find out what else they have been hiding beneath the city streets today.